Hey guys, Shelby Smith here with Jiminy Crickets here in Ames, Iowa. I just wanted to hop on and answer some of the questions that were sent to me from you guys. First of all, thank you so much for the questions. You guys had a wide array of different things. There's some common themes in there, but I'm going to go through them one by one, so this might be kind of a long video, but I wanted to address all of your questions. So bear with me as I read them off of my computer here that I'm recording on. So the first one, what are your regular duties as a cricket farmer? From morning to night, how does that routine go? So regular duties as a cricket farmer is not a lot different from other livestock farmers. So you need to check the conditions, you need to check feed, water, depending on the life cycle. If the crickets are ready to breed, you need to give them some sort of substrate to lay their eggs in. But day-to-day chores, you can do them either morning or night. They're not like other animals that have to be fed right at 8 a.m. in the morning. Depending on what part of the life cycle they're at, they may be set for food and water, and it's just a case of checking conditions. Second question, how much protein is in a cricket? So this varies somewhat widely depending on what you feed them. My crickets are about 60 to 65% protein. I've seen other nutrition facts that have claimed that their crickets are 70% protein. I'm not sure if that is a difference of feed or difference of processing where they maybe separate out some of the fats from the protein. My personal crickets are 63.4% protein, according to my latest test. What is the point in eating bugs, and what makes people want to eat a bug? Here in the West, not everybody wants to eat a bug. But what the point of eating bugs are is no different than why you eat any other protein. Your body needs it. So believe it or not, there's actually parts of the US and parts of the world that are what you call protein deserts. So it's not possible or not super convenient for them to get sources of protein. So insects are a source of complete protein, just like any other animal protein. That this helps mitigate some of those protein deserts. These are an option for them where there may not be things like herd animals, so they may not have cows or goats or pigs readily available, but they do have insects. So the insects are actually a source of complete protein, which every single human needs complete proteins in their diet. Protein is the building block of all of the cells in your body, so it's the one thing that you can't get by without. So that's one good reason to eat bugs, is because you need protein. Number 4, how do you raise crickets the correct way? That's kind of funny. What temperature do they need to be kept at? What do they eat? How do they reproduce? And the best method of raising your own cricket farm. You're trying to raise for your own fishing bait and already have a worm farm and a minnow farm. Oh, so you're well off to the start. So I would argue that there's not really a correct way to raise crickets necessarily. I think of cricket farming as more of an art than a science, and it's kind of like medicine, and that medicine is a practice, so it's constantly evolving. So is cricket farming, so is any type of farming. So methods are always improving, so what seemed right to me a year ago, I now look back and go, I was so wrong. But just some of the basics. What temperature do they need to be kept at? That really depends on the breed that you're raising. But so for me, for Acadia domesticus, I keep them at 86 degrees and above, but at a cap of, I don't let them really go above 92 degrees. It's just kind of a sweet spot for me. What do they eat? Fancy chicken feed is the best way that I can describe it. So crickets, if somebody tells you that they have a fully vegetarian cricket, it's probably not a super healthy cricket, because believe it or not, crickets eat other insects in the wild, so they need a complete amino acid profile in the form of some sort of animal protein as well. So if you don't give them that complete amino acid profile, they are cannibalistic, so they will start eating each other. They're very related to shrimp in that way. Any sort of on-land shrimpery, not sure what you call them, but we have them here in Iowa. If you get the population densities too high in those and don't give them adequate feed, they'll start eating each other as well. So crickets and shrimp are very similar that way. what do they eat? How do they reproduce, and the best methods of raising your own cricket farm. So best methods for you may be very different from me. It all really depends on scale. Different methods work at different scales. So what works for me at sort of a small to mid-sized farm may not work if you want to do a massive warehouse of like 12,000 square feet. You're going to want different methods than me. Also very different from if you're just doing one container of crickets in your garage or something like that so that you can raise your fishing bait. It depends on your scale. It's kind of a hard question for me to answer. But if you're looking on the smaller side, I actually would really recommend a lot of reptile forums. There's a lot of people that are very good at telling you what works on a small scale. The larger scale stuff, there tends to be not as many resources because that's just not what generally people are looking to do, is things at scale. How do they reproduce? So the males will fertilize the females, and then the females lay eggs. That is basically, in a nutshell, what happens. The very basic. Okay, so this is kind of the same question. How do you breed crickets, or do they breed? Yes, they breed. I don't actually breed them. They take care of that themselves. As long as your conditions are correct, they will happily breed, no problem. They're very prolific breeders. The females actually only need to be fertilized once every 2 weeks, and then they will lay fertile eggs for that entire span at a clip of 5 to 10 eggs per day. So you get a lot of eggs. That's not usually an issue. Also, why do they make the noise that they do? So those noise-making crickets, the chirping ones, those are actually males. The females don't make any sounds. It's called stridulation, so it's the rubbing together of the male's wings. And the males do that to try and attract the females so that they'll breed. That being said, there are multiple different chirps that they have. Some of them are aggressive towards other males. Some of them are just the mating call for the females. I don't know how to interpret them, but there are different ones. How large is the container you keep them in? What do they eat? How long do they live? Do you keep them in your house? Is it noisy where you keep them? So how large are the containers that I keep them in? I have them in 50-gallon storage totes. I have about 200 of those in my current space. If I were to get much bigger, myself, like personally in my farm, I would start transitioning towards a more open growing system where I don't actually have containers. But at the size I'm at, the bins still work well. What do they eat? Already covered that. How long do they live? So in captivity, I let my crickets go, I harvest them at about 45 days on average. Depends on many different things, including conditions, as to how fast they mature. Out in the wild, though, crickets will live up to 5 months. In captivity, under controlled conditions, so no temperature swings, those crickets actually aren't going to make it too far past 6 weeks at the max. Like I said, for me, optimal is about 45 days in the summer, sometimes less than that. But out in the wild, they can live up to 5 months because they're enduring temperature swings up and down, which dramatically affects their growth. Do I keep them in my house? Absolutely not. You wouldn't raise a cow in your house. Generally speaking, you wouldn't raise a pig or a goat or anything like that. Bottle-fed animals are totally different. You need to do that for animal health sometimes for a short period of time. But in general, you're not going to raise other livestock in your house, so please don't raise crickets in your house. If you're going to raise them indoors, within your house somewhat, I would suggest your garage, because that's at least a little bit out. Is it noisy where you keep them? When they are mature and they are chirping, they are noisy. One of these days I'm going to download a decibel meter so that I can see exactly how noisy they are. But yes, when they're all chirping at the same time, they're pretty noisy. How do they mate? So the basic way to explain this is that the female mounts on top of the male. He fertilizes her, and she has this little receptacle that she pulls back up inside of her body, and then lays fertile eggs for 2 weeks. That's a really crude explanation, but it's basically what happens. Why do people cricket farm? This has varying motivations. For me, I was looking for something that was niche and that was not traditional agriculture. Here in Iowa, obviously, monocropping is very common, so corn and soybeans, or traditional livestock, so cows, pigs, chickens, egg layers. We are the #1 state for corn, soybeans, pigs, eggs, and probably something else that I'm missing. I don't know how clued in you guys are to the ag economy, but probably for the past 7 years, it's been really down. It's been really tough. So commodity crops, in some respects, it's already a carved out path, and so you know what to expect. But in other ways, you're at the mercy of the commodity markets that don't always tie into what reality is. So, but being in the middle of an agriculture area, I have certain advantages that maybe other places don't for starting up something like a cricket farm for a niche sort of purpose. So I have a lot of readily available supplies that translate well at a very low cost in comparison to some parts of the country. So that's really nice for me. A lot of my growers, so the majority of my growers, I have 7 now in the state of Iowa, possibly 8. Can't keep track at this point. My growers, all of them except for one, are part of traditional farming. So they're actually using cricket farming as a diversification piece so that they can diversify their income on the farm. Because ultimately in farming, you're always going to have a bad year at some point. So your goal is always to be able to diversify into something different. So that's the majority of the reason, I think, why they're doing it. Although I should probably ask them. Just want to know how many crickets y'all own on average per farm. So in my, I would say roughly 650 square feet, I have about 2 million crickets. My growers are all at least that big. I have one that will have about 8 million crickets total when they're fully up and running. So I'd say in general, the range is usually 2 to 8 million crickets every cycle. How much profit can you make? This varies widely as well. So it comes down to what your cost of production is. So it's just like any other production ag. If you can get your cost of production lower than your counterparts, then your profit margins can be higher. Because in general, the market sets the rates for what people will pay for something in particular. So that varies farm to farm. I don't really have a good answer for that one. How much labor does it require to do the job? This kind of varies across the life cycle. So in general, day to day, for my 2 million crickets, I can be in and out of the barn in an hour, hour and a half, depending on what is going on. So that includes changing waterers, adding feed, all of that kind of thing. Now, if it's hatching and or harvesting, hatching crickets adds more time. Harvesting crickets adds more time. So I would say on average, though, things probably even out at about 15 to 20 hours a week total. But it can be way more than that in some weeks, and it can be way less. It's not unlike people who do contract hogs. Like your daily chores doing hogs doesn't take very long. But when you're turning over the barn, when you're sorting pigs, when you're doing all of that, that's where the labor really comes in. So it kind of ebbs and flows. Why did you choose this as your career? I really wanted to start something. I've always been part of an entrepreneurial family because farmers in general are entrepreneurs. Most people don't think of them that way, but all farmers are basically independent business people. They don't often get thought of that way, and I would say outside of farming communities, in some respects, farmers are kind of looked down upon as maybe not as intelligent, which is quite the misconception. Let's put it that way. So every farm basically has to be run as a business independently. There are certain situations where people custom farm or farm on contract and they're just providing the labor, but even so, those still have to be run as businesses. You have to know what your input cost is. If your input cost isn't greater than what your market price of whatever you're growing, so hogs or chickens or whatever, it's not a viable business, so you're not going to be able to continue. So I grew up around that my entire life, seeing self-employed people. Both my mom and my dad were self-employed. They'd start multiple businesses. My dad's farmed for over 30 years. So starting my own business kind of fit. I was originally an investment banker in Ireland, so I traded equity derivatives for a Canadian bank. I have a master's in finance, but I really didn't like it. And so I moved back and started farming with my dad, just the normal corn and soybean stuff. But he was the one who really encouraged me to look at niche markets. And crickets came up. And I thought I'd just try it out. And I've never really looked back. And it's really been a learning process. Let's put it that way. Are there different types of crickets? Yes. Off the top of my head, I don't know the exact number of species of crickets there are in the world, but there's a lot of them. And each of them actually has a unique chirp or a unique song. There are some breeds that the females actually do chirp. I think it's only like 1 or 2 though. But what I raise are Acadia domesticus, so it's the common house cricket. So oftentimes if you go to the pet store or the bait shop or anything like that, the little brown crickets, that's probably Acadia domesticus. They're one of the only 2 that are allowed to be shipped across all 50 state lines live because they're a non-invasive species. They're native to Southeast Asia, so they don't survive even down south because it gets too cold. They don't like it when it gets below 80 degrees. They start to die off fairly quickly. What type of crickets have the best source of protein? That's a good question. Again, I am not entirely certain how to answer that because there's a lot of different factors that go into it. What you feed them makes a big difference. A higher protein feed is going to result in a higher protein cricket. Now, I don't know if that translates across breeds or anything like that. Chitin content also makes a difference. Chitin impacts the bioavailability of the protein. So if you have a lower chitin content, theoretically you have a more bioavailable protein. There's a lot of things that go into that, so I don't know is my straight answer. What types of food can you make with crickets? So many. So cricket powder can be incorporated in just about everything. So the sky is really the limit. I have recipes for cinnamon rolls, cookies. Obviously, I produce energy bars and roasted crickets of all different flavors. You can mix it in hummus. You can bake bread with it. You can mix it in smoothies. So many different things that you can do with it. It's very versatile. How do you cook them and give them their flavor? Good question. So I actually dehydrate them. Well, first, you kill them in the freezer. Not everybody knows that. That is how they're killed. And then I boil them to eliminate any pathogens. I know not everybody does that. It's just a choice that I make from a food safety perspective. I boil the crickets first, and then I dehydrate them. And then at that point, they go into 2 different sides. Either one gets ground into powder or the others become roasted seasoned crickets. And think of seasoning those just like you'd season nuts or seeds or something like that. How do you cricket farm? What techniques have you learned on this journey? Like I said earlier, my techniques have changed massively, even in a year. I've been in my new facility for a little over a year, and goodness, I'm pretty sure my first crickets didn't go in there until a little bit later in May. But man, it's a lot of things change. It's a lot of trial and error. There's not a whole lot of resources out there for raising crickets at scale, specifically for human consumption. There's some consulting services and all of that, but in all honesty, they haven't been in business very long, so they're still learning as well. And like I said, you know, cricket farming is just like any other farming, and that it is a practice that is continually evolving. So nobody has it perfected, nor will anyone ever have it perfected. So things have changed a lot as I've gone. What are some of the different uses of crickets and bugs? This is the last question. There's so many different applications. So there's food applications, there's feed applications, so they can go in as protein replacements for many different animal feeds. So most animals, just like us, need a complete amino acid profile. Most of the time, plants, solo plants don't have that complete amino acid profile. Soy is an exception. Things like quinoa, all of those things, they are complete proteins technically, though they may be lacking in certain amino acids that some animals need in a higher dosage. So there's potential for replacement in feeds for animals. So for example, like layer chickens, they typically have like bone meal and other rendered, I think, pork products probably, that get mixed into their feed. If they don't have that, their eggshells break too easily, and then that doesn't work. So it's a possible replacement for things like that. Anything that fish meal goes into, because sustainability practices for fish meal are tough. Overfishing is definitely a problem. But fish meal goes into a lot of fish feeds. Now, you can substitute a lot of different things to give it a similar nutrition profile, but the problem is the fish don't find those alternatives tasty, and so they don't eat them. They do, however, like insects. So that is a possible replacement, one-to-one replacement for fish meal, which is interesting. And then there's other like real off-the-wall things, like people researching crickets as vectors for vaccines. So you can actually grow out the strain of vaccine in crickets' guts and use that as a vector for vaccine rather than what is traditionally used, which is egg whites. So there's lots of different applications. Insects are a wild and crazy world that you can spend hours and hours researching the different possibilities, and it'll blow your mind. So those are just a few things that I know off the top of my head. And I'm not a trained entomologist, so I probably butchered a lot of those things, so I'm sorry. I hope this answered most of your questions. Thanks again for asking them, and thanks for being curious and thinking about it. If you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me, and thanks again. See you guys.